This is the Dollemore Daily, and I'm Jesse Dollemore. We are witnessing the steady erosion of Donald Trump's grasp on the power of his presidency. There still remains a number of steps before he's gone, and many of those steps involve the investigatory process, which has only just gotten underway in the House via the official impeachment inquiry. Another critical step in the process is to garner some Republican support. And this is going to be the toughest step of them all, mainly due to the fact that Republicans have proven themselves to be shameless patsies for Donald Trump. Up to this point, they've been willing, if not eager, to ignore and cover for his disregard for the rule of law, disrespect for his oath of office, and contempt for the restrictions placed on him by the Constitution of the United States. Almost every single one of them is quaking in their loafers, terrified that a poorly written tweet from this mentally defective game show host might be directed at them. There are, however, cracks that are beginning to develop in the Republican wall of complicity. And I'm going to talk about them in a moment, but first, I want to discuss what it is that is forcing them to face facts and warm to the idea of impeaching and removing Donald Trump from the White House. There is a crumbling of the normally hardened facade of lies and distortion that comes from the usual suspects who make up the front lines of the Trump disinformation operation. Just this weekend, in fact, both Mick Mulvaney and Mike Pompeo blew it, outing themselves as the hapless goons they've always been. Mulvaney, who's like if Harry Potter grew up to be a dick, appeared on Fox News Sunday this weekend with Chris Wallace, where he embarrassed himself like a pro. Well, like a pro if it was a competition for shamefulness. He dodged and weaved and fumbled his way through attempting to deny the fact that only hours before he admitted to a quid pro quo related to the withholding of crucial military aid to Ukraine and investigating Donald Trump's political rival, which absolutely constitutes asking a foreign power to interfere in our democracy. Prepare yourself for all of the cringe.
Why did you say in that briefing that President Trump had ordered a quid pro quo that investigating the Democrats, that aid to Ukraine depended on investigating the Democrats? Why'd you say that?
Again, that's not what I said. That's what people said. That I said, here's what I said. I'll say it again, and hopefully people will listen this time. There were two reasons that we held up the aid. We've talked about this at some length. The first one was the rampant corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, Chris, is so bad in Ukraine that in 2014, Congress passed a law requiring us to make sure that corruption was moving in the right direction. So corruption's a big deal. Everybody knows it. The president was also concerned about whether or not other nations, specifically European nations, were helping with foreign aid to the Ukraine as well. We've talked about that for quite a while now. I did then mention that in the past, the president had mentioned for me to time about the DNC server. He'd mentioned the DNC server to other people publicly. He even mentioned it to President Zelensky in the phone call, but it wasn't connected to the aid, and that's where I think people got sidetracked this weekend at that press conference. Two reasons for holding back the aid.
Let me pursue that, though.
Sure.
Because I believe that anyone listening to what you said in that briefing could come to only one conclusion. Let's play what you said.
Sure. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
You just described as a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happen as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
You were asked specifically by Jonathan Karl, was investigating Democrats one of the conditions for holding up the aid? Was that part of the quid pro quo? And you said it happens all the time.
Yikes. It must be a bummer for Donald Trump's White House chief of staff to go on Donald Trump's favorite channel expecting a spa day and instead getting treated to an oncoming train. Anyone else in Mick Mulvaney's position would be running for the exits right now in anticipation of the many indictments that are sure to come from this. especially considering that John Bolton, who is a radical, right-wing conservative nutter, not some deep state operative, even John Bolton wanted nothing to do with this corrupt Donald Trump Ukraine operation, telling a colleague to go to the White House lawyers about it. The New York Times reports Mr. Bolton got into a tense exchange on July 10th with Gordon D. Sondland, the Trump donor turned ambassador to the European Union, who was working with Rudolph Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, to press Ukraine to investigate Democrats, according to 3 people who heard the testimony. The aide, Fiona Hill, testified that Mr. Bolton told her to notify the chief lawyer for the National Security Council about a rogue effort by Mr. Sondland, Mr. Giuliani, and Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House chief of staff, according to people familiar with the testimony. Quote, I am not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up. Mr. Bolton, a Yale-trained lawyer, told Miss Hill to tell White House lawyers, according to 2 people at the deposition. Listen, you know it's a bad sitch when even John Bolton is slowly backing out of the room with his hands in the air. And this is only what we know right now. The House impeachment inquiry is only weeks old. There is so much more to uncover, and people are seeming eager to get themselves before Congress to tell them what they know, even if that means defying the orders of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who has instructed his State Department officials to disregard congressional requests and subpoenas, and wrote Congress telling them, I'm concerned with aspects of the committee's request that can be understood only as an attempt to intimidate, bully, and treat improperly the distinguished professionals of the Department of State, including several career Foreign Service officers whom the committee is now targeting. Also writing, let me be clear, I will not tolerate such tactics, and I will use all means at my disposal to prevent and expose any attempts to intimidate the dedicated professionals who I am proud to lead and serve alongside at the Department of State. Well, this writer of fiery letters also appeared yesterday with George Stephanopoulos and wasn't nearly as fiery or confident. In fact, watch Pompeo try to bob and weave only to end up with his back on the canvas. And pay particular attention to the oh f*** moment where a cogent answer was replaced with a blank, stupid stare and almost 4 full seconds of excruciating silence while he desperately tried and failed to come up with an answer about the clear and admitted quid pro quo from Donald Trump to the Ukrainian president.
But President Trump ordered Mick Mulvaney to suspend the aid, and you saw Mr. Mulvaney right there say that one of the reasons was indeed this idea that the Ukrainians had to pursue these political investigations.
I'll leave to the chief of staff to explain what it is he said and what he intended. I can speak clearly to what America's strategic objectives were in providing this defensive weaponry to the people of Ukraine.
So do you agree then with Senator Murkowski that it would have been inappropriate to withhold the military aid unless this political investigation was pursued?
George, I'm telling you what I was involved with. I'm telling you what I saw transpiring and how President Trump was working to make the evaluation about whether it was appropriate to provide this assistance.
But that's what I'm asking is, would it be appropriate to condition that?
Yeah, George, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals and secondary things based on what someone else has said. George, you would have never done it when you were the spokesman. I'm not going to do it here today.
Except it's not a hypothetical. We saw the chief of staff, the acting chief of staff.
George. You just said George, you just said if this happened. That is by definition a hypothetical.
The chief of staff said it did.
George, you asked me if this happened. It's a hypothetical. I've told you what I observed, what I saw the process related to this very funding.
You know things are bad when the first in his class at West Point, former congressman, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and current Secretary of State of the United States of America is completely paralyzed in befuddlement when confronted with the fact that the White House Chief of Staff admitted on camera to the very thing he is defiantly denying took place. Crooks, liars, and scumbags Every single one of them. I guess we shouldn't be surprised by Mike Pompeo's complete and total lack of character or fortitude. All of this is the same political coward who doesn't mind being usurped in his duties as Secretary of State. As Rudy Giuliani, Trump's actual Secretary of State, does his job for him. What's the word that conservative trolls love to throw around? It seems to me that it would work perfectly in describing Mike Pompeo right now. Oh yeah, cuck. Mike Pompeo is actively being cucked by Giuliani. And he seems pretty okay with it too. Well, all of this rank public corruption isn't going unnoticed. And not just from Democrats and other concerned American citizens. Remember those cracks that are beginning to develop in the Republican wall of complicity that I was just talking about a few minutes ago? Well, it is starting to happen. Republicans are beginning to rouse from their dreams of endless tax cuts for billionaires and are coming around to the reality that the USS Donald Trump is a sinking ship that is going to drag the rest of us down with him unless some drastic action is taken to hold him accountable. Just a couple of days ago, former Ohio Governor John Kasich officially announced that he supports the impeachment of Donald Trump.
You just heard Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff. Where does this put you?
Anna, this has been a very difficult 24 hours for me. The issue of impeachment is really big to me. And when I heard what Mulvaney said, the chief of staff of the president, it pushed me really across the Rubicon. And I'll tell you why. Withholding military aid, vital military aid, to a nation like Ukraine, which has Russian troops inside its territory, that's threatened all the time, that withholding it so that a political operation can take place, investigate this thing around the server, and we're going to withhold the aid until you do that. To me, it's totally inappropriate. It's an abuse of power. Now, I know that there are presidents that will withhold aid because they have policy differences, but this is not a policy difference. And so my view is that, look, I fought with people on the air about, is there a quid pro quo and does this rise to the level of impeachment? I now believe that it does. And
Okay.
I say it with great sadness. This is not something I really wanted to do. I mean, I voted to impeach Bill Clinton, and that was really hard. And this has been excruciatingly hard. But this kind of behavior, in my opinion, cannot be tolerated, and action is going to have to be taken.
And then there's also Florida Republican Congressman Francis Rooney, who hasn't gone quite as far as John Kasich, but is openly voicing his grave concerns for the problematic actions of Donald Trump.
So you've called the Ukraine scandal very, very serious and troubling. You say you're not ruling out the possibility of an impeachable offense. If Speaker Pelosi were to call a vote tomorrow for launching an impeachment inquiry, not impeachment itself, but just an inquiry to find out what the facts are, how do you think you'd vote?
I'm not 100% sure right this second. I want to hear what Ambassador Taylor has to say Tuesday, and I'm hoping to have a chance to hear Ambassador Bolton before any of that would happen, because what I've heard so far is quite troubling. It's quite troubling that we had a rump diplomatic outreach of civilians derogating our paid public servant diplomats.
Now, listen, I know that a single former governor and congressman doesn't exactly spell doom for Donald Trump, but it is a start. Because a week ago, there were 0, and who knows where we'll be in another week or another month. There are several others who have offered sideways criticisms, and plenty more who complain and carp about Trump in private. But as the investigation gathers steam and facts find their way into the light of day, I predict there's going to be growing numbers of Republicans who support removing this clear and present danger from our republic. Remember that most people were against impeaching Richard Nixon until they weren't. There was a moment when public opinion switched, and when it did, it did. So what's it going to take to sway the public stances of Republicans in Congress? Well, that's for you to call your representatives and senators, especially if they're Republicans, and tell them that you expect them to support the impeachment and removal of Donald Trump from office. This, after all, is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people.